Welcome back everyone, thank you so much for clicking on the video. Today we are breaking down one of the most powerful sorcerer builds in Diablo 4, including the best skills, stats, gear, and aspects to use. This build has dozens of damage amplifiers, and when you see all of them synergized together, you'll immediately realize why this is one of the strongest setups for the sorcerer. Ice Shards is the main DPS spell on this build, and it's easily one of the best choices for high single target damage. This build has high lucky hit chance, frigid breeze, and avalanche, which makes mana management almost non-existent since you'll be able to infinitely shoot your ice shards. Barriers also play a huge role in this build since they help you easily amplify your damage and make the sorcerer feel less like the typical glass cannon that's often associated with the class. If you want a build that has insane damage, perfect ad clearing capabilities, and tons of survivability for World Tier 4, this is the perfect build for you. There's no active basic skill on this build, but you definitely want to have Firebolt unlocked so you can activate the Firebolt enchantment. When this enchantment is selected, direct damage from all skills applies additional burning damage, which means your frost skills and everything else included will set enemies on fire. With this build, your damage against frozen and burning enemies will stack. Ice Shards is a core skill that players should not overlook. This skill fires impactful projectiles that deal considerable amounts of damage, especially if players upgrade them fully. I also recommend using Ice Shards as your second enchantment, which automatically conjures Ice Shards to attack and fly towards frozen enemies. Using the enhanced Ice Shards modifier takes things a step further since it unlocks a 40% chance for your Ice Shards to ricochet to another enemy. Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies, which is perfect for crowd control. Destructive Ice Shards is also highly recommended since it's an easy way to apply vulnerable. Vulnerable damage has a base value of 20% and is increased by stats, aspects, and your Paragon tree. Vulnerable damage is also one of the best damage amplifiers in the game. The sorcerer has very powerful defensive skills, and this build utilizes every single one of them. Flame Shield is great because it makes you completely immune to damage for a short period of time. The skill offers great survivability, helps you set up powerful combo attacks, and also immobilizes enemies thanks to the aspect of Binding Embers. This aspect lets you move unhindered through enemies while immobilizing them at the same time. Frost Nova is probably the most important skill on the build. This skill unleashes a torrent of frost that freezes nearby enemies for 3 seconds. The more points you invest in this skill, the shorter the cooldown will be. With the enhanced Frost Nova modifier, killing enemies frozen by Frost Nova reduces its cooldown by 1 second up to 4 seconds per cast. Mystical Frost Nova will help you apply vulnerable to enemies hit by Frost Nova for 4 seconds, increased to 6 seconds against bosses. To make Frost Nova even stronger, you'll want to apply the Frost Splits aspect to your build. With this aspect, Frost Nova gains an additional charge, but the cooldown per charge is increased by 40 to 30%. With Ice Armor, a barrier forms around you for 6 seconds, absorbing a percentage of your base life and damage. Barriers play a huge role in this build. Every time we have a barrier active, we get a huge damage buff on the build, and obviously the extra survivability in addition to that. With the enhanced Ice Armor modifier, mana regeneration is increased by 25%, which will help you spam Ice Shards longer. Teleport is the last defensive skill on this build, and trust me when I say it's not a skill you want to overlook. It's a must-have for World Tier 4 since the enemies do way more damage and can easily overwhelm you if you are not careful. Teleport is perfect since it gets you out of sticky situations fast and cleanses you of all control impairing effects. Deep Freeze is also on this build. This ultimate temporarily makes the sorcerer invulnerable, as well as chills and instantly freezes enemies around the area. The AoE for this skill is pretty large, but the cold damage inflicted is relatively low. Still, this spell is great to have on the build because it paralyzes the entire battlefield for several seconds and adds yet another layer of extra survivability. Avalanche is the key passive skill on this build, and it is best paired with an Ice Shards build, as you'll constantly get the chance to buff your damage and conserve valuable mana. Specifically, this ability gives you a small chance to make your next frost skill consume no mana and deal 40% 10% extra damage. While the 10% chance for this key passive to activate may seem small, remember that the chance is doubled against vulnerable enemies, meaning you do 80% damage against vulnerable enemies. Furthermore, since abilities such as Deep Freeze strike enemies many times, you will get multiple chances to trigger this key passive when using just a single ability. Next, let's take a look at the skill tree so I can show you how to allocate your skill points, and so we can go over some important passive skills for this build to help you do tons of extra damage. For the basic skill, you'll want to invest 2 points into Firebolt, and you'll also want to make this basic skill your first enchantment. When you enchant this basic skill, direct damage from all skills will apply burn to enemies. With this build, your damage to both burning and frozen enemies will stack. For example, every time you attack an enemy with Ice Shards, you'll set them on fire, apply chill, and eventually freeze them. 2 different damage pools, both stacking on top of each other. Next, Ice Shards is the main core and DPS spell on this build. You'll want to invest as many points as you can into this skill since it's your primary source of damage against all enemies. Ice Shards is also the second enchantment on this build, and it's one of the best options since the enchantment causes Ice Shards to automatically conjure and fly towards frozen enemies. This is a huge benefit to have, and it only takes the crowd control capabilities of this build even further. Using the enhanced Ice Shards modifier takes things a step further since it unlocks a 40% chance for Ice Shards to ricochet to another enemy. Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies, which is perfect for crowd control. Destructive Ice Shards is also highly recommended. It's a real easy way to apply vulnerable to enemies. Again, like I said earlier, vulnerable damage has a base value of 20%. You'll increase this value with stats, aspects, and your Paragon tree. Vulnerable damage is one of the best damage amplifiers in the game. I also recommend investing 1 skill point into Devastation so you can fully upgrade the Elemental Dominance passive skill, which increases your Ice Shards damage by 9% when you're above 50 mana. The mana control feels really good on this build, and you'll almost always be above 50 mana. Next, moving into the defensive skills, you can see that all 4 defensive skills are unlocked and applied to the build. These skills are pretty much required for high tier nightmare dungeons since enemies can one-shot you if you're not careful. Flame Shield is going to be your main source of immunity, and that's really all it's used for, so you don't need to invest more than 1 skill point. Engulf yourself in flames, burning surrounding enemies, and becoming immune for 2 seconds. This powerful defensive skill can be even better if you add the aspect of Binding Embers, which we do have on this build. This aspect lets you move unhindered through enemies while immobilizing them at the same time. Now, if I skip down here just a little bit for 1 second, you'll see a passive skill called Devouring Blaze that I have fully upgraded. Deal 30% increased crit damage to burning enemies. If they are immobilized, the crit damage bonus is increased to 75%. Every time you activate Flame Shield, you'll be able to immobilize enemies for a short period of time. You'll also want to add 1 point into Teleport. Teleport is a defensive skill you need for World Tier 4. The enemies are more difficult to kill, and you won't last more than 5 minutes in a dungeon without a skill that can make you unstoppable and pull you out of overwhelming situations. I would also recommend unlocking the enhanced Teleport modifier, which reduces the cooldown of teleport by 0.5 seconds for each enemy hit. With Ice Armor, a barrier forms around you for 6 seconds, absorbing a percentage of your base life in damage. This skill is just adding another layer of protection to the build. When you're running high tier nightmare dungeons against enemies that are many levels higher than you, you want to add any source of survivability you can. With the enhanced Ice Armor modifier, mana regeneration is increased by 25%, which will help you spam Ice Shards longer. Frost Nova is the last defensive skill on this build, and it's also the most important skill. Frost Nova is used to freeze enemies instantly, and it also puts them into a vulnerable state so you can eliminate large crowds fast. This skill unleashes a torrent of frost that freezes nearby enemies for 3 seconds. The more points you invest in this skill, the shorter the cooldown will be. With the enhanced Frost Nova modifier, killing enemies frozen by Frost Nova reduces its cooldown by 1 second up to 4 seconds per cast. Mystical Frost Nova will help you apply vulnerable to enemies hit by Frost Nova for 4 seconds, and this is actually increased to 6 seconds against bosses, which is really nice. To make Frost Nova even stronger, you'll want to apply the Frost Blitz aspect to your build. With this aspect, Frost Nova gains an additional charge. There's also 2 passive skills you need to unlock in this section. Paragon. With the Glass Cannon, you deal 18% increased damage, but you take 9% increased damage in return. The damage value can be increased even further if you have additional Glass Cannon ranks on your gear. You also want to fully upgrade the Elemental Attunement passive skill, which applies Lucky Hit to your build. Critical strikes have a 15% chance to reset the cooldown of one of your defensive skills. This passive helps keep Frost Nova active more often, and it pairs nicely with the Frost Blitz aspect, which adds an extra charge of Frost Nova to your build. There's no conjuration spells on this build, but there are some passive skills worth unlocking in this section. Precision Magic increases your lucky hit chance by 15% when fully upgraded, and it's essential for this build since lucky hit plays an important role in stacking extra damage. You also want to invest 1 point into Align the Elements so you can fully upgrade the Protection passive skill. With this passive, using a cooldown grants 30% of your maximum life as a barrier for 2 seconds. By now, you've probably already realized how important barriers are in this build. They increase survivability, yes, but they also buff damage thanks to some aspects on the build that we'll go over later. No mastery skills on the build, but I highly recommend investing a point into Inner Flames so you can take advantage of the Devouring Blaze passive skill that we mentioned earlier. If you remember, Firebolt is one of the enchantments on this build, and this enchantment causes all enemies hit by any skill to burn, allowing you to take full advantage of Devouring Blaze. With this passive active, you deal 30% extra crit hit damage against burning enemies. If they are also immobilized, which they will be thanks to the Flame Shield and the gloves on the build, the damage bonus is increased to 75%. That's a guaranteed 75% crit hit damage boost against pretty much every single enemy. For the ultimate skill, you want to use Deep Freeze. Now, even though this ultimate doesn't do a lot of damage, it still offers 2 important benefits for the build. 1, it makes you immune for 4 seconds, giving extra time for cooldowns to refresh or for you to maybe pop a healing potion. And 2, it applies Chill to all enemies on screen, which is nice considering your Ice Shards will automatically conjure and eventually fly towards the frozen enemies, thanks to the Ice Shards enchantment. It's also worth unlocking the Prime Deep Freeze modifier since you gain 10% of your base life as a barrier for 6 seconds for each enemy you froze on screen. Supreme Deep Freeze is nice too since it basically refreshes your cooldowns after Deep Freeze expires. There's 4 passive skills here that you need to unlock to get the most damage out of this build. With Permafrost, Frost skills deal 15% extra damage to elites. With Hoarfrost, you deal 9% extra damage to chilled enemies and 18% extra damage to frozen enemies. With Icy Touch, you deal an additional 12% increased cold damage to vulnerable enemies, and last but not least, Frigid Breeze, one of the best passives to help you conserve mana. Cold damage against vulnerable enemies has up to a 20% chance to generate 15 mana. Once everything is procced on this build, you're looking at well over 60% lucky hit chance against vulnerable enemies, which means it will feel like you have endless mana when you're shooting at mobs of vulnerable enemies. The best key passive for an Ice Shards build is Avalanche. This key passive not only increases your damage significantly, but it also helps conserve mana. Frost skills have up to a 10% chance to make your next cast of Ice Shards consume no mana and deal 40% extra damage, 80% extra damage against vulnerable enemies. This key passive is made even stronger thanks to the aspect of Frozen Memories that we have on the amulet. This passive applies an additional cast to Avalanche, making it twice as effective in combat. Ultimately, this key passive is incredibly vital in any Frost related build since it will significantly buff your overall damage while also helping you conserve resources during a difficult battle. For the Paragon tree, you want to find room for 3 very powerful sorcerer glyphs. Now, if you take a look to the left here, you'll see that my 2 highest attributes on this build are willpower and intelligence. The first node you'll unlock is the Elementalist node, which adds 20% extra non-physical damage to your build if you have at least 200 intelligence. Keep in mind, non-physical damage is the sorcerer's primary source of damage, and this node alone buffs the damage of all of your spells. The first glyph I recommend adding is the Control glyph. Now you can see here, based on my current glyph level and dexterity purchased within range, I'm able to add almost 100% extra damage to crowd-controlled enemies, which is pretty much any enemy that's burning or frozen. After that, you'll unlock the Elemental Balance node, which adds an additional 20% non-physical damage to the build as long as the requirements are met totaling out to 40% extra non-physical damage added to the build already. The first board I unlocked is the Burning Instinct board, since it offers a ton of damage buffs to burning enemies and gives you room to add the Exploit glyph. Dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases your damage by 1% for 6 seconds up to 10%. This glyph is currently adding 40% extra vulnerable damage to the build while in combat. There's also some really powerful nodes here worth unlocking as long as you meet the requirements. With Cinders, you gain 20% extra damage to burning enemies, and the same thing also applies to the Kindling node up here, which adds another 20% damage to burning enemies, including an additional 16% damage against elites. After unlocking some of these nodes, I eventually moved into the Frigid Fate board, which helped me make the build even better. Dealing cold damage to vulnerable enemies increases your lucky hit chance by 1% for 5 seconds up to 15%. Lucky hit chance plays a huge role in this build, so it's ultimately going to determine how effective you'll be in combat and how long you can spam Ice Shards for. It's also worth unlocking the Weakness node, since you add an extra 20% vulnerable damage to your build so long as you meet the requirements. Now, the last glyph I added to this build was the Enchanter glyph. Easily one of the best glyphs for the Sorcerer, since it basically buffs the raw damage of every single one of your spells. I'm not sure what my next stop is on this board, but I'll be sure to share my thought process once I reach level 100. The last thing I wanted to cover in the video is the stats, gear, and aspects on the build. Now, all of the stats in this build will fluctuate depending on what level you are and what stats came rolled onto your gear. It's going to be difficult to find the best and most perfect stats until you reach 100. So until then, just focus on including the most beneficial stats in your build. The best stats to look out for includes frost damage, cooldown reduction, crit chance, crit damage, damage to close enemies, vulnerable damage especially, lucky hit chance, core skill damage, etc. I currently have 23% crit chance on this build, not including the extra 40% crit chance that I'm getting from the Elementalist aspect. Also, you can see here 91% crit damage, but keep in mind this does not include the extra 75% crit damage bonus that we're getting for attacking burned and immobilized enemies from Devouring Blaze. 120% vulnerable damage, 92% extra damage against crowd-controlled enemies, 63% extra damage to burning enemies, 100% damage with fire, and over 130% damage with cold. Starting with the helmet, I have the aspect of Disobedience, gain 0.50% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 50%. This aspect is crucial for World Tier 4 survivability. For the chest piece, I'm using the Frost Splits aspect that I mentioned a couple times earlier. This aspect is extremely powerful since it adds an extra charge to your most powerful skill, Frost Nova. Now, even though this aspect increases your cooldown, having 2 Frost Novas and Elemental Attunement active will hardly ever put you in a situation where you have to wait a long time for Frost Nova to come back. At the end of the day, it's all about timing your skills efficiently and making the most out of every single opportunity. For the gloves, I'm using the Ancestral Unique Fists of Fate. These gloves come equipped with a ton of variables to help you increase the damage on your build significantly. For starters, these gloves apply 4 different lucky hits to your build, applying a small chance for you to heal, restore mana, and immobilize and daze enemies with every single attack. The immobilize is great since we deal 75% increased crit damage to burning and immobilized targets. These gloves also come with a unique aspect that helps tremendously with DPS. With this aspect, your attacks randomly deal 1 to 220% of their normal damage. After adding these gloves to the build, I noticed a huge increase in my burst damage, especially against elites. For the pants, I'm using the aspect of the Protector. Damaging an elite enemy grants you a barrier absorbing up to 3,404 damage for 10 seconds. This effect can only happen once every 30 seconds. This and the aspect of Disobedience are just prime examples of defensive skills you need to have if you want to stay alive. For the boots, I have the aspect of Binding Embers. Flame Shield lets you move unhindered through enemies. Enemies you move through while Flame Shield is active are immobilized for 3 seconds. Now, in addition to the gloves, this aspect is adding another source for you to immobilize enemies, giving you a huge crit damage buff in return. For my weapons, I prefer the wand and focus combination over the two-handed staff just because of the lucky hit chance. For my wand, I have the aspect of Piercing Cold. Ice Shards pierce 3 times, dealing 25% less damage per subsequent enemy hit. The aspect of Piercing Cold causes Ice Shards, your primary core skill, to pierce 3 times instead of just 1. Now, even though it's a 25% damage decrease per hit, it ends up being more damage overall, and it's exceptionally useful for the sorcerer. For the focus, I'm using the Elementalist Aspect core or mastery skills cast at or above 100 mana gain 38% increased critical strike chance. As long as you're stacking damage on vulnerable enemies and increasing your lucky hit chance over time, with timing you'll learn how to keep your mana at or above 100 mana at all times. This build already has 23% base crit chance, which means you'll be above 60% crit chance whenever you're in combat. For the first ring here, I imprinted the aspect of control. With this aspect, you deal 25% more damage to immobilized, stunned, or frozen enemies. And one thing to keep in mind, each of those are going to stack, which means you can deal up to 75% extra damage, for example, to any enemy that has all 3 control impairing effects applied. These damage buffs and percentages are going to be determined by what type of gear and rolls you have. This 25% that I have might be 50% for you. The damage capabilities on this build are never ending. For the second ring, I added the accelerating aspect. Critical strikes with core skills increases your attack speed by 22% for 5 seconds. This build has over 60% crit chance, helping you increase your Ice Shards attack speed, which gives you a huge boost in DPS. And lastly, for the amulet, I added the aspect of frozen memories. The avalanche key passive now applies to 1 additional cast. I highly recommend finding room for this aspect on your build. It's going to double the damage you deal with avalanche, and it's also going to help conserve mana. I am currently level 76, and right now I'm having no issues pushing tier 50 nightmare dungeons. I'm excited to upload the level 100 version of this build once I get there, and I really do appreciate you guys watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos just like this one coming soon.